In April 2014, a team of archaeologists, journalists, and documentary filmmakers gathered in the desert outside Alamogordo, New Mexico, and began digging. They were looking for video game cartridges. Not because they were hobbyists, not because it was a weekend project. They were there because one of the most successful companies in American history, a company that had single-handedly created an industry worth $3.2 billion, had, in 1983, loaded millions of unsold game cartridges into trucks and buried them in the desert under concrete. And nobody had been entirely sure for 30 years whether the story was true or an urban legend. This is the video game crash 1983 Atari story. And the buried cartridges are not the strangest part of it. The strangest part is how a company that had built the fastest growing business in American corporate history, faster than any company before it, destroyed an entire industry in approximately 18 months. And then how a Japanese toy company rebuilt everything from scratch in less than 3 years. Atari was founded in 1972 in Sunnyvale, California, by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney. Its first product, Pong, the table tennis arcade game, was placed in a bar in Sunnyvale in November 1972. Within weeks, the machine had broken down because the coin box was full. Pong generated more coin revenue per machine than any amusement device previously measured. Bushnell understood immediately what this meant. Not that Pong was successful, but that video games were a category. By 1977, Atari had launched the Atari 2600, a home console that allowed consumers to play multiple games by swapping cartridges. This was the key innovation, not a dedicated game machine, but a platform. You bought the hardware once, then bought software, individual game cartridges, indefinitely. It was, structurally, the same business model that every gaming platform would use for the next 50 years. The 2600 launched at a retail price of $199, roughly $900 in today's terms. It sold over 500,000 units in its first year. By 1980, it was the best-selling consumer electronics product in the United States. In 1978, Warner Communications acquired Atari for $28 million. Ray Kasser, a former textile executive, replaced Bushnell as chief executive. Kasser was a professional manager of consumer products, not a technologist, not a game designer. But under his management, Atari's revenues grew from $100 million in 1978 to over $2 billion in 1982. By that year, Atari represented over 60% of Warner Communications' total operating profits. The division was, by every financial metric, the fastest growing consumer products company in American history. In 1982, the North American home video game market was worth $3.2 billion. That was larger than the Hollywood box office in the same year. Atari held approximately 80% of that market. The company employed 10,000 people. Its Sunnyvale headquarters was expanding so rapidly that it was occupying buildings faster than it could furnish them. The cultural penetration of Atari's products was complete. Studies from this period showed that an Atari 2600 was present in 12% of all American households, a figure that exceeded the penetration of cable television. The game that encapsulated the moment was Space Invaders, a port of the Taito arcade game licensed for the 2600. When Atari released it in 1980, it quadrupled the installed base of the console in 12 months. Consumers were buying the hardware to play a single game. This had never happened before in consumer electronics history. Atari had created what analysts would later call a killer application, a product so compelling that it justified the purchase of the entire platform. The success attracted attention. By 1982, over 60 companies were producing games for the Atari platform. Not all of them with Atari's authorization. The platform was open. There was no technical protection preventing third-party development, and the profit margins on cartridge software were so high that the incentive to enter was irresistible. The structural problem building inside the Atari ecosystem was visible to anyone who looked at it carefully. The platform was uncontrolled. Any company could produce a cartridge, place it in any store, at any price, with any level of quality. There was no approval process, no quality standard, no technical barrier to entry. By 1982, consumers were returning cartridges to stores at rates that had never been seen in consumer electronics retail. The products did not work as advertised. Games promised on the packaging delivered experiences that bore no resemblance to the arcade originals they claimed to replicate. Retailers began stacking returned cartridges in bins at the front of stores, $1 each, or 5 for $1, clearing them out of inventory. Atari's internal decision-making was not calibrated to detect this signal. Kasser and his management team were measuring success by units shipped, not units sold through to consumers. A cartridge that had been manufactured and shipped to a retailer counted as revenue. A cartridge sitting on a shelf or being returned to a distributor was a problem that appeared in the financial statements later and differently. This distinction between sell-in and sell-through was the accounting architecture of the crash. Atari was recording revenues it would later have to reverse. The financial statements looked healthy until they did not. The breaking point had a name, E.T., the extraterrestrial. In the summer of 1982, Atari paid $21 million to license the rights to produce a game based on Steven Spielberg's film, the highest-grossing movie in American history at that point. The licensing deal required a delivery of the finished game in time for Christmas of 1982. That meant Howard Scott Warshaw, the assigned designer, had 36 days to develop and ship a complete video game. Modern game development timelines run to years. Warshaw had 5 weeks. Atari manufactured 12 million E.T. cartridges for the Christmas 1982 season. The United States had approximately 10 million Atari 2600 consoles in homes at the time. Atari had manufactured more copies of one game than there were machines capable of playing it. The game, released in December 1982, was widely described by reviewers and consumers as confusing, frustrating, and unfinished. Warshaw has given detailed public accounts of what he built in 36 days. A technically functional game that attempted too much given the hardware constraints and the time available. The gap between the film's cultural resonance and the game's delivered experience was devastating to consumer trust. The return rate on E.T. cartridges reached approximately 30%, an extraordinary figure for a retail product in any category. 5 million unsold or returned cartridges accumulated in Atari's distribution system within 3 months of launch. In the final quarter of 1982, Warner Communications announced that Atari's revenues had fallen 40% below forecasts. The company had predicted revenues of $2 billion for the full year. The actual figure came in at approximately $1.1 billion. Warner's stock fell 32% in a single day, one of the largest single-day drops in New York Stock Exchange history at the time. Ray Kasser resigned in July 1983. Over the subsequent 18 months, Atari underwent a series of restructurings that reduced its workforce from 10,000 to around 2,000. The division was eventually sold by Warner Communications in 1984, separated into 2 companies, the Consumer Division and the Technology Division, and never recovered its former scale. In September 1983, Atari arranged for approximately 14 million unsold cartridges, including the ET, Overstock, but also other underperforming titles, to be transported by truck to Alamogordo, New Mexico, crushed by a steamroller, and buried in a landfill under concrete. The burial was covered briefly by the local newspaper, and then largely forgotten. The North American video game market collapsed between 1983 and 1985 with a speed and completeness that had no precedent in consumer electronics. Total industry revenues fell from $3.2 billion in 1982 to approximately $100 million in 1985, a decline of over 96% in 36 months. Retailers stopped stocking video games. Electronic stores removed the category entirely. Industry analysts published reports questioning whether home video games were a permanent product category or a fad that had peaked. In 1983, Nintendo, a Japanese playing card company founded in 1889 that had entered the video game business in the late 1970s, launched the Famicom console in Japan. The machine was technically superior to the Atari 2600 and included a crucial innovation: a lockout chip that prevented unlicensed software from running on the hardware. Third parties could only produce games with Nintendo's approval and under Nintendo's quality guidelines. This single design decision addressed the core problem that had destroyed Atari's market. Nintendo launched the Nintendo Entertainment System in the United States in October 1985 to overcome retailer resistance to stocking video games, a category that had just collapsed. Nintendo positioned the NES as a toy bundled with a robotic accessory and offered stores a consignment arrangement: pay only for what sells. By 1988, North American video game revenues had recovered to approximately $2.3 billion. By 1990, they exceeded the pre-crash peak. The industry that Atari had built, and then buried, literally, had been reconstructed by a company from Kyoto that nobody in Alamogordo had ever heard of. The standard version of the Atari crash story focuses on the ET game, the bad product that broke the market. That version has the advantage of being concrete and satisfying. One bad decision, one famous property, one catastrophic outcome. But the ET game was a symptom. The cause was structural: a platform with no quality control, a market with no barriers to entry, and an accounting system that recorded success based on products shipped rather than products wanted. Atari knew about the third-party quality problem. Industry publications had written about it. Retailers had raised it in conversations with Atari representatives. The signal was present. The organizational response was not. Nintendo's solution, the lockout chip, the licensing program, the quality approval process, was not technically complex. It was organizationally simple: a gatekeeper, a standard, a mechanism by which the platform owner accepted responsibility for what ran on their platform. Every major technology platform that has operated successfully since 1985 has used some version of this model. Apple's App Store approval process, Google Play's developer policies, Steam's curator program. The specific mechanisms differ. The underlying logic is identical to what Nintendo figured out in Kyoto between 1983 and 1985. If anyone can publish anything, nothing has value. If the platform owner accepts accountability for quality, the platform can sustain a market. The question worth thinking about is whether we have fully absorbed this lesson in every domain where it applies, or whether there are platforms right now not necessarily video game platforms, where the same structural problem is accumulating in the same slow way, waiting for the same kind of Christmas season.